Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Friday Ramblings. I am your host. I am David, the Bardic one. And I'm here to break down a very little special treat because we're going with a video game franchise that has not only had its heyday, but has continued to ride a bit of a nostalgia wave over the past several years. That is right, folks. You know it. You love it. At least if you're as old as me. We are breaking down Double Dragon. Real quick, Double Dragon is one of the original arcade beat-em-up games, at least as far as we consider the modern genre. And as such, it is something that has inspired many other beat-em-up franchises that came afterwards. There were some that had come out before, but Double Dragon was one of the first to really hit huge internationally. You know, in both Japan, in America, just all over. Anywhere where Double Dragon's been released, it's been hot. Double Dragon was originally, as a franchise, created by Technos Japan, who produced some other great games and franchises that we may talk about in the future. Technos, however, went bankrupt in 1996 due to a variety of factors, including, well, simply put, that, like a lot of companies in the 90s, as we moved into 3D style gaming, the games they were best at really just didn't translate great, and their games quit being huge hits. It happens. Happens in a lot of entertainment industry. No judgment. Originally, the intellectual property rights to these franchises were owned by a holding company called Millions Company Limited, who basically all they did was legally own the IP so they could release a lot of ports. We're not going to go through all the different ports of all the different Double Dragon games. Just suffice to say, most of the classic games can be found in pretty much any game-playing format you want. So, don't despair. If these games sound interesting, you can easily play them. Eventually, though, the intellectual properties would be bought by Arc System Works, another video game company, and they currently own the legal rights to Double Dragon as well as the other games produced by Technos Japan. So that's the big thing out of the way. The next big thing we're going to get out of the way is the non-video game media, because it's just kind of a real quick thing. It was a miniseries done by Marvel Comics in 1991. In 93, there was a 2-season cartoon show that was pretty much like every other cartoon show being produced in the early 90s outside of Disney, which is that it was very bright, colorful, super heroic filled, and of course taught the children a good edutainment moral, because that's something cartoons have to do. You got to be a good influence on children. It's Americans. It's a thing we have. I'm not going to get in the socio-political aspect of it, but it's worth, if you can track down an episode online, it's worth watching for a bit of a chuckle. It's got some camp value to it. Also, in 1994, they released a theatrical movie. Now, theatrical movie did have a few people worth taking notice of, as far as actors, such as Scott Wolf, Alyssa Milano, Robert Patrick. It also starred Mark Dacascos, as well as Julia Nixon, Christina Wagner, George Hamilton, Vanna White, Andy Dick. People that were nice little, hey, I know that person kind of things. Otherwise, the movie is extremely camp, and it's, as I said, if you're in for a chuckle, something you can kind of, MST, by all means, check it out. But it helps if you're an old person like me and remember when people were making movies this cheesy because they had like $100 budget to work with. They were making movies this cheesy because nobody really understood how to adapt video games back then. Honestly, looking at the movies based off video games, I don't think a lot of people know how to adapt video games into live action movies now. I mean, that is a pretty shallow well of properly done adaptations. Like, really, really shallow. I don't know if it's even a well. It might just be like a puddle on the sidewalk. But they at least gave it their best effort and tried to have some fun with the movie. It is watchable. So with that out of the way, let's get to the core of the Double Dragon franchise, and that is the video games. Alright, let's do this, people. Now we're excited. Now we're getting to the fun stuff. The original Double Dragon game was released in 1987 to arcades. The game's development was led by Yoshihisa Kishimoto and is considered a spiritual and technological successor to Technos' earlier beat-em-up Nekketsu Koha Kunio-kun, which we will talk about the Kunio-kun series much later on. For those of you outside of Japan, you would know this game as Renegade. So, the game itself was extremely popular in arcades and was ported to pretty much everything at the time. It became Japan's third highest grossing table arcade game of 1987, before becoming America's highest grossing dedicated arcade game for 2 years in a row in 88 and 89. It also won Electronic Gaming Monthly's 88 Game of the Year award. And the most famous home version is the NES version. However, there have also been versions released for, as I said, pretty much every other console that was created at the time, such as the Sega Master System, the Atari 2600, the 7800, the Atari ST, the Amiga, the Amstrad CPC, the Commodore 64, the Game Boy, the Genesis, and the Atari Lynx, among other platforms. It also got a remake called Double Dragon Advance, released for the Game Boy Advance in 2003, and has shown up on port and compilation titles in more recent years. This game is literally one of the icons of the 80s. So what's it about? Well, simply put, your girlfriend gets punched in the gut by a gang, taken away, and you gotta rescue her. The protagonists of the game is Billy and Jimmy Lee, as they fight their way through the Black Warriors or Shadow Warriors, depending on your translation, all to rescue Billy's girlfriend Marion. You use a variety of martial art techniques to beat people up, including picking up weapons dropped by your enemies. This is all good times. The game is incredibly simple and somewhat short by modern standards. The important thing of this game is that it would introduce iconic antagonists such as Abobo, Linda, and Willie, or William, as some other games have called him, again, depending on your translation and some of the later sequels. Now, the biggest difference between it and some of the home ports is that the NES actually took a lot of liberties with the translation due to the hardware differences. The most notable difference being that the arcade game has an omission of the two-player cooperative game mode in favor of alternating play. The plot was slightly altered as a result of this change. as due to you taking turns back and forth, you are playing solely as Billy Lee, and in a swerve, your brother Jimmy Lee is the secret leader of the Black/Shadow Warriors. Now, they do change up some of the level designs as well, adding some new areas, featuring greater emphasis on the platform and trap evasion. That was a nice touch in the arcade game to break up the monotony of beating people up, but in the NES version, in certain stages, especially the later ones in the game, was actually a little bit more of an emphasis than the beat 'em up, giving the game almost a pseudo beat 'em up platforming hybrid style. Still, while there is enough differences between two games that you can call the NES version an adaptation more than a straight port, they are both excellent games, and at the core the plot is the same: rescue your girlfriend Marion. This leads us into Double Dragon 2: The Revenge, released in 1988, also originally as a coin-operated arcade game. This time it opens up with Marion being shot by the new leader of the Shadow Warriors, who is retaliating against the Lee brothers after the events of the previous game. Thus, we go to war with the Shadow Warriors for revenge. It is implied at the beginning that Marion is shot to death. So, what does this game bring to you? Well, the biggest change is that you now have the ability to attack to the left and right, which in a two-dimensional game basically translates to being able to punch what is directly in front of you and what is behind you. This meant that you had to re-strategize the way you dealt with crowd control fighting. Your character also will learn more advanced techniques as they play through the game, which is also good times. Bring back the weapon system. All in all, the game adds a few mechanic changes, new level designs, obviously, but at its core, it is an expansion of the original game concept. They don't go too crazy overboard with the new things. The major difference now is that the final battle of the game is against shadowy doppelgangers of Billy and Jimmy, and thus, much like a few other games at the time, including Zelda 2 and the Shadow Link enemy, you face off in a mirror match style challenge, which is all well and good. It was an interesting thing to do. Hey, you fought, you went through, you became a great butt kicker, now you got to fight somebody who's literally the exact level of butt kicker you are. You have to figure out how to beat yourself. Very Buddhist Zen philosophy. To beat your enemies, you must defeat yourself. The game was quite successful, being the 7th most successful table arcade game unit of the month in Japan. United Kingdom, the game was number 3 on the Atari ST sales charts. And it has also shown up in various remakes and ports. So, greatness. Once again, the NES port, which is the primary one most people think of for home release, did feature various changes from the arcade version. Bring us to the final of the classic trilogy. and the last of the games that was released for the arcade first and foremost before receiving home ports, and that is Double Dragon 3, the Rosetta Stone. Now, the game does feature some various changes due to it not being developed internally at Technos. Technos instead contracted the development out to East Technology. You are still primarily playing as Billy and Jimmy Lee, having been approached by a mysterious fortune teller, sending them on a worldwide journey to retrieve 3 mystical Rosetta Stones and uncover the mystery surrounding them in Egypt. The game continued to get ported to various home releases, which is all well and good. The biggest change in this game is that you have access to item shops. You can purchase in-game power-ups by inserting more coins into the arcade cabinet, with each item costing 1 credit, with them changing here and there as you go. Thus, you can literally buy your way to an easier win. Nowadays, this is kind of a common mechanic in a lot of games. The infamous pay-to-win that drives people insane with certain mobile casual games. This kind of experimented with the base concept many, many years before. The game does discard the directional attack buttons from Double Dragon 2, returning the punch and kick format of the original Double Dragon, and featured some new abilities that were not seen in previous games. Good times. You can also, by being close to each other, utilize certain tag team maneuvers, such as a back-to-back hurricane kick or a triangle jump kick. So, good times. The NES version was retitled to the Sacred Stones instead of the Rosetta Stones. And once again, various changes were made to the game, to the point that, once again, some people would consider it more of a vague adaptation over a direct port. Let's see. The English version does alter the plot of the game during the translation process, referencing another rescue mission to save Marion, even though she was presumed dead at the beginning of the previous game. Additionally, certain characters had their motivations within the game for helping or hindering the Lee brothers altered. So, play either version. At its core, it's still a fun beat 'em up. But it was one of the things that tends to continue to divide hardcore Double Dragon fans, which is arcade version or NES version, because every NES version had varying levels of alterations done to it. Me personally, I have played all 3 games in my youth, back when the NES was a much more recent console. I never beat any of them, and I never played the arcade versions. So I am basically, to me, the NES versions are my Double Dragon. So, I really, no disrespect to the arcade versions, but when I think of Double Dragon, I do think of the NES versions. Still, if you prefer the arcade versions, by all means, plenty of respect to you. We have no beef. Here's where things get a little tricky for the series. Now, in 1991, a Game Boy game referred to as Double Dragon 2 was released. However, it is unrelated to the arcade and NES versions of Double Dragon 2 The Revenge. The game is actually a localization of one of the Kunio-kun games, specifically Neketsu Koha Kunio-kun Bangai Ranto Hen. And the localization team swapped the graphics around to make it look like a Double Dragon game. So this is kind of a third version of Double Dragon 2. This is kind of an oddball thing, though, because since they mostly just changed the graphics and the plot as opposed to the gameplay mechanics, the game kind of plays as a hybrid of the two franchises that were most famous with, that Technos was most famous for, which would be the correct way to say that sentence. I've personally never played this game, so, you know, I can't say much on it. But the fact that it is basically a reskin of a different franchise, I don't know. I may research and play it later on one day, just to see how it feels compared to proper Double Dragon games. Now, as I said, Double Dragon 3 was the last of the arcade releases. However, the series did not end. Super Nintendo brought us Super Double Dragon. They dropped the numbering on it, which is going to be important later, remember this. It was simply Super Double Dragon, or in Japan, Return of Double Dragon, Sleeping Dragon Has Awoken, and was released in 1992. It was published by Trade West in North America, but Technos was still behind the programming of it. The game did not have an arcade release, as previously stated, and as such, some of the mechanics have changed up. You continue to play as Billy and Jimmy Lee, fighting a variety of villains, including the returning Williams, as well as Baker, Jeff, and twin martial arts masters Chin Ro Fo and Chin Rom Pyo. Meaning they are basically kind of like evil versions of Billy and Jimmy Lee. The game was not super popular, in a way kind of set up the beginning of the decline of Double Dragon's popularity, at least, you know, but it is still a solid, if extremely difficult game. If you are a fan of Super Nintendo games, I would recommend giving it a run, but expect it to beat the snot out of you the first several times you play it. I'm not kidding. I have attempted to play the game. It is hard. Still, you are primarily fighting as a version of the Shadow Warriors gang, which were not prominently featured in the previous Double Dragon 3, so it's a nice throwback plot-wise. The game also features the Dragon Power Gauge, which allows characters to perform special attacks depending on how much power the players accumulated. And if the power gauge is completely filled, players' regular attacks will gain extra strength for a limited period. This introduced another layer of mechanic that would challenge veteran Double Dragon players, which is always nice to do. This is one of the few times where the characters of Billy and Jimmy Lee were not simply palette swaps, but in their fighting abilities, as the characters have different basic punches, and Jimmy's roundhouse kick is different as well. This was a case where they took advantage of the better hardware of the Super Nintendo to make the different brothers stand out more as would happen in various other franchises. Mario and Luigi were originally straight palette swaps of each other that would eventually go on to be mechanically different in how they play. So, good times. Sticking with Super Nintendo, we have Double Dragon 5, The Shadow Falls. See, that's right. The previous game was simply Super Double Dragon, no number to it. But when the next game came out, they used the 5 numbering because it was the 5th core Double Dragon game, even though the previous never got its 4 number. Hee. Now, this game was actually a fighting game developed by Leland Interactive Media and was released initially for the Super Nintendo and later for the Atari Jaguar by Telegames. It's an American-produced sequel and had little to no credit involvement by Technos Japan outside of licensing the IP. Besides being a fighting game, it was also based on the previously mentioned cartoon series and plays similar to Capcom's Street Fighter II. It was also released on the Genesis. The main appeal of this game is that being a fighting game, it gives you the chance to play in a primary mode villainous characters. Although, as I said, since they are the cartoon series equivalent, these are not your classic Abobo Williams type characters, but the goofy, campy villains from the cartoon series. Still, if you want a fighting game that's going to give you a little bit of difference from the traditional Street Fighter, Mortal Kombat, Tekkens, give the game a whirl. It's not going to hurt you. Just remember, if you're trying to marathon the Double Dragon franchise, that this game will look different because it is based off the cartoon series as far as its character roster. Finally, in 1995, we got another fighting game, this time developed and published by Technos Japan themselves, based off the 1994 live-action film. See, this is the other reason we started with the TV series and film, because they got games inspired by them. So it makes sense in context. I don't have to sit there and say, oh, this game was based off a cartoon series that I didn't previously mention. Now it's just, oh, hey, remember this thing I talked about before? Well, now it comes back up again. It's almost like I have a plan. Fortunately, Technos and Neo Geo didn't have much of a plan because the movie was a bomb, and as such kind of hurt the game's ability to sell copies. Still, the character roster includes 10 immediately playable fighters and 2 boss characters. Billy has faster techniques and Jimmy has stronger. You also get to play as the movie adaptation of Marion, classic character Abobo, a borrowed character from another Technos game, Burnov, who is a former wrestler with a rivalry against Abobo, as well as various other martial arts and street fighting characters. Fighting against the CPU, the player will compete against all 10 of the playable fighters, including a clone of their own character. The first opponent can be freely selected by the player. After all 10 of the default fighters are defeated, the player will face Shuko's bodyguard Duke before challenging Shuko himself. There is in the home Neo Geo consoles, because of course Neo Geo did a lot of arcade stuff too, there was an arcade version, based on the Neo Geo hardware. Sorry. For those who are not familiar with Neo Geo, they primarily produced arcade games and eventually started producing their own consoles where they would port their own arcade games. So there was an arcade version of Double Dragon Neo Geo, as well as a home console version. The game eventually was also ported to the PlayStation. And as I was saying, in the console version of the games, Duke and Shuko are both playable via a cheat code. Again, like the previous Double Dragon 5, if you're a fighting game aficionado and you can track down a copy without breaking the bank, by all means, give the game a whirl. It's not that the game's inherently bad, it just didn't bring anything to the table and reminded people of a movie that is only good for unintentional comedy. After this, we would see a break for Double Dragon, mostly because, as I mentioned, like a year later, Technos went bankrupt, and the immediate follow-up company was only really interested in ports and remakes. Still, our old buddy WayForward Technologies would step up, and in 2012 released Double Dragon Neon, which is good times. Original series creator Yoshihisa Kishimoto was consulted during the game's development and described Neon as a very Western adaptation of Double Dragon, with a mood and feel that reminded him of the original arcade game. Now, the plot in many ways is almost a remake of the original game. It starts with the very familiar opening sequence of Marion getting punched and kidnapped. However, this time we have a new super boss character in Skullmageddon, a undead sorcerer fighter guy. Very OP. However, the gang is still the Shadow Warriors, and you are still playing as Billy and Jimmy Lee. The game does feature modern, nice, HD graphics. But instead of trying to look hyper-realistic, they opt instead, and this is where the neon part comes in, to kind of celebrate the fact that the game's origins are in the 80s and give the game a tongue-in-cheek throwback feel to it. The game is very bright and colorful, a lot of neon pastel colors, which was the fashion in the 80s. Skullmageddon himself, while a hard villain to beat up when you do fight him, is a bit comedic, as are several other elements of the game, especially ones that reference previous games. For people who played the classic Double Dragons, there's a point where you have to fight a Bobo, and you can easy beat him by tricking him into falling off a conveyor belt into a pit of nothingness, as well as there being a few other pits that you can knock regular enemies into in a couple of the early stages. Both of these reappear, and dialogue from the enemies points out the inherent silliness of these level setups, including when you come up on the first big pit in a mid-level part of the game, the mooks looking down into the pit and questioning what a hole this deep is doing in the middle of the city, before promptly getting kicked into it. So, good times. I've actually played Double Dragon Neon. I have beaten it, although it took me quite a while because my beat-em-up skills are only middling, and there is some tricky jump and projectile dodging sequences in the later levels of the game. Still, with the full voice acting, HD, but with a classic, cartoony in the best ways feel to it, as well as a general satirical 80s nostalgia throwback theme, which, let's be honest, in the 2010s, the whole modern games done retro style nostalgia milking thing was really big. So that's part of the fun of Double Dragon Neon, is it's almost mocking these games that were trying to tug at your childhood heartstrings and being like, yeah, no, look, we know the game was from your childhood. But let's be honest, we can still have goofy fun with all of this. Power-ups and special attacks abound, including a lighthearted leveling up system and customization of what specific power-ups you have. A dragon gauge, similar to the one shown in Super Double Dragon Returns, as well as auxiliary power-ups that can help influence the way you play the game or make playing the game easier depending on your play style. For instance, equips that are based around, hey, do you tend to get hit a lot and lose your health? Well, when your health gets below a certain level, you'll get a stat boost to keep you from actually dying. Or you could go with something like, hey, accumulate your XP faster to level up quicker. You know, hey, every time you level up, this will boost your strength stats up super high, but your more defensive bonuses will be almost non-existent, so you can basically make yourself into a one-punch man. Or vice versa, if you just want to be an invincible tank that takes your sweet time taking people out. That's what I'm saying. Neon's an incredible game because of that. Very highly recommended if you're a beat-em-up genre fan, because it combines the best mechanical updates of the last couple decades with a classic feeling game that is just tongue-in-cheek enough that you will enjoy playing it even when the game is beating the snot out of you. Now, we got one more entry into the franchise from here, and that is Double Dragon 4, which was released by Arc System Works, who, as I told you, currently owns the IP. They actually bought it after Double Dragon Neon came out. Why is this Double Dragon 4? Wouldn't this be like Double Dragon... okay, let's not count the fighting game, since that kind of jumped genres. Still, even if you don't count Neon, because it was competing rivals, remake, nostalgia throwback product, shouldn't this be 6? Yes, but remember, Super Double Dragon technically never used the 4. So Double Dragon 4 as a title was still up for grabs. Plus, unlike Neon, this game is much more of a true retro throwback style. Remember how I mentioned before that a lot of games are trying to tug at your nostalgia heartstrings? Well, this is Double Dragon 4's game. The game is done in more of a classic 8-bit style, and the story mode is picks up after the events of Double Dragon 2, so in a lot of ways it's like a parallel sequel to 3. So, if you love your retro games, I want a game that's much more, hey, this feels like this game could have come out way back then, and visually looks like it, Double Dragon 4 is the one for you. Now, I haven't played this game personally, but, you know, I may one day. I don't know. I have a lot of fun with Neon. It tends to scratch my itch pretty good for a modern entry in the classic franchise. So, what are you going to do? So, what does all this mean? Well, if you're a new gamer that really wants to understand what makes the beat-em-up genre so great, chase down a copy of the original series. There is a compilation called the Double Dragon Trilogy that combines the classic 3 games. You know, and check them out because that is going to teach you everything you need to know about classic beat-em-up games. Quite literally, this is a franchise that the beat-em-up genre was built off of. If you're looking for games that will challenge you, even if you're not a big retro type person, hey, Double Dragon games will force you to learn and beat them through stubbornness, because they do not hold your hand and they do not offer a super easy mode. But what if you just want to play something mindless and a little bit violent? Well, did I mention that you're basically running through several levels, beating up street punks that may or may not have punched out or shot your girlfriend? Oh, and you get to, after beating them up, occasionally take their weapons from them and use their weapons to even further beat up their friends? I mean, there's no blood, but inherently this will scratch that beat the snot out of people almost mindlessly itch as good as any game out there. And hey, even if you're not a beat 'em up fan but you still like the mindless violence, fine. You got the Super Nintendo Double Dragon 5, you got the Double Dragon Neo Geo. Go fighting game violence style. Double Dragon's here for you, and that's the point. So, that's all I got to say. You got my recommendations. You got your history breakdown. You know what to look for. Meanwhile, I'm going to go chill. Give myself a little bit of a breathing break here. A lot of words thrown out today. And I'm going to be back in 7 for another rambling. And we'll certainly, in the months to come, go back to Technos Japan. Especially that Kunio-kun series. Because it's kind of interesting how a lot of those games were brought over in America because they weren't always, in fact, they were almost never treated as the same franchise. Some of those franchises are part of this nostalgic redoing game movements. What? Really? That's right. Technos may no longer exist, but their imprint is still being felt today. So let's talk about that in the future. If you don't want to miss those videos, make sure you subscribe. Hit the little notification bell. Throw me a comment, throw me a like, give your friends the links, so we can all have a fun time together. We ramble on Friday, but you can watch the archives anytime you want. And we are always here to keep things just a little positive. You take it easy, folks. I will be back because I enjoy doing this, and I appreciate everybody that watches my videos. Bye-bye, folks. Mwah.